Hey everybody, Brandon here. Super excited to be able to deal with this issue today. So a couple of months ago, I was on campus and I witnessed a protest that was happening on campus between pro-Palestinians and pro-Israelis and the rest. And it was fascinating because I saw a sign on one side that said, Jesus was a Palestinian refugee. And it would seem, because I saw a sign on the other side that I'd never seen before, that looks to have been handmade, possibly even in the moment, that said Jesus was an Israeli. And I remember going, neither one of those is true. And so, in looking to deal with that, because I've had a lot of conversations since then from people who believe these statements to be true, or in their context, they look to try to find reasons to connect Jesus to this political mess, this war, this whatever you want to call it, this construct that's happening right now in that area, and attach Jesus to it because of his proximity to the area when he walked this earth. But with that in mind, I just need to note a couple of things and just kind of maybe provide some history in this that will help us look at the truth of the matter. First of all, Jesus was not a Palestinian refugee. Jesus was born in the Bethlehem of Judea in or around 4 BC and lived to around 30 to 33 AD. Those dates, I give those kind of broadly, mainly because we may have lost a couple of years along the way in the Middle Ages. We're not really 100% sure, but those are the years, give or take, around that time period. So during this time, the region we now consider part of modern-day Israel, and Palestine was under Roman rule, specifically within the province of Judea. So Rome was an empire at that time, and so this entire area was under Roman rule, and it was called the province of Judea. Now, Jesus was born into a Jewish family in Bethlehem of Judea, grew up in Nazareth in Galilee, and was part of the Jewish community. Now, what do I mean by Jewish community or born into a Jewish family? And we think of that differently today because we almost associate it with Israel, like if you're Jewish, you're Israeli and the rest. And it's not the case. Usually, predominantly, would be, especially this time, a direct descendant. And we know this from Matthew and from Luke and the genealogies, a direct descendant of one of the 12 tribes of Israel. So that would be a historical, familial Jew, the way that we use the terminology today, but a descendant of the 12 tribes of Israel. We know this to be the case for Jesus and Mary and Joseph and the rest, and was part of the Jewish community. This is really beyond contestation. That is the reality of the time of the man named Jesus. The term Palestine, from the Latin Palestina, was used by the Romans after the Bar Kokhba revolt in AD 132 to 135. This is 100 years removed after Jesus lived. This is when they renamed the province Palestina. Prior to this, it was Judea, it was Galilee, it was all those, but it was not Palestine. This revolt that happened, the Bar Kokhba revolt, was preceded by two other major uprisings. The first was often referred to as the Jewish-Roman War, 66 to 73, which led to the destruction of Jerusalem and the Second Temple. So this is where we have just some horrific scenes of a revolt of the Jewish people in that time, because the Romans had really two laws, two major laws. It was keep the peace and pay your taxes. And that was not what was happening in this area at that time. And then the second one was what's often referred to as the Kitos Wars, 115 to 117. So by the Bar Kokhba revolt, there's been multiple revolts that have happened in this area, and the Romans had simply had enough. So the immediate causes for this third revolt include Emperor Hadrian's policies, such as the prohibition of circumcision, the establishment of the Capitolina on the site of Jerusalem, and the construction of a temple to Jupiter on the Temple Mount, where the Second Temple had been destroyed in 70 AD. Now, Simon Bar Kokhba emerged as the leader. He was proclaimed the Messiah by Rabbi Akiva, one of the most respected Jewish scholars of his time, which galvanized support for the revolt. Now, this speaks to what historically a lot of the Jews of that day were looking for. These descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel, was they were looking to be reimagined as a nation state again, going back to the days of David and Saul and Solomon and the rest, where they had national borders, and they were that very premise, a nation in the way that we would see it, a nation state. And so they were looking for a Messiah in the same realm. Now, this shouldn't surprise us even in the first century with Jesus. Even Peter and others were constantly looking for, at this time, are you going to set up your kingdom? Is this what's going to happen? And that's not what Jesus was, and not what Jesus intended. His kingdom is not of this world, but that was the premise. And so it shouldn't surprise us at all that this was still part of the theology, in essence, of the Jewish people of that day. And so Bar Kokhba was made the Messiah, was set forth as that, and so people got behind him to get rid of the Romans and to have their own nation. This revolt began around 132, with Jewish forces initially achieving kind of remarkable successes. They captured numerous towns, including Jerusalem, and established a government that even minted its own coins. Now, these Jewish rebels employed guerrilla warfare, using the terrain of Judea, including caves and underground tunnels, to their advantage. Now, I find that this fascinating from a connection point to where we have today with Hamas and the rest, that these tactics that were used, this of hiding in the caves and the rest, there's a connection here that I find just humorous in its connection, tragic in the war concept, and horrific in its nature. But now you have 1,800 years removed, the same area, the same place, the same tactics, the same premises. Now, Rome responded with significant military force, including legions from around the empire. Julius Severus, one of the Rome's most capable generals, was sent to crush the revolt, which he did in spectacular fashion. The revolt's end came with the fall of Betar, which is Bar Kokhba's stronghold in 135. The final battle was devastating for the Jewish resistance, which Bar Kokhba reportedly dying in combat. That's when he died. Now, the Romans exacted a harsh reprisal, at least even from our standards, but this was well known that this is what would happen if you revolted against Rome. The Jewish population of Judea was decimated, with accounts of hundreds of thousands killed, sold into slavery, and forced into exile. Most historians note that not a single Jew was left in the entire area of Judea, that it was basically cleaned out of individuals, what we would call a genocide of the individuals after this revolt. The revolt led to the end of Jewish political autonomy in Judea for nearly 1,800 years. Not until 1948 would we see this again. Hadrian banned Jews from Jerusalem, renamed the province from Judea to Syria Palestina, and further suppressed Jewish religious practices. This was a key component. Now, discoveries like the Cave of Letters in the Judean desert have provided invaluable insights into the revolt, including letters written by Bar Kokhba himself and coins from his brief state and other artifacts of the time. Now, the province of Judea was renamed to Syria Palestina as a means to erase Jewish connection to the land. That was its premise and its purpose. The Philistines were the historical enemies of the Jews in the area, and so to name it Syria Palestina was specifically meant to be a slight to the Jews, and it has been historically. But thus, and this is a key component, during Jesus' lifetime, the region was known as Judea, Samaria, and Galilee, not Palestine. Never was. Jesus grew up in the areas called Judea and Galilee under Roman rule, not Palestine. Jesus was not a Palestinian. It would be historically inaccurate to call Jesus a Palestinian, for he never lived in a land called Palestine. Now, just because it's called that today does not mean that that's what we should call or utilize the terminology for him in that same premise. I kind of equate it to while someone may have like an American nationality, there's a lot of people, even within the United States, who come from Native American Indian tribes and the rest. And imagine you no, you're only an American because you're born in America. And you say, well, nationality, yes. Same way, they were Romans, but they were from Judea. They were historically from the ethnicity and tribes of the 12 descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel. So to overlay modern constructs on top of this is doing a disservice to history and a disservice and being a bit disingenuous with our terminologies, because the terminologies do matter. Now, I also need to know, Jesus was not a refugee as we portray or think about it. Not in reality. Not the way we use the terminology. So this is from the UN. Owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, or membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality. Outside of the country of his nationality would be the key thing here. You see, because Egypt was part of the Roman Empire. It would be more consistent to say that Jesus and his family fled the area of Judea to a different state, much like in the USA, not into another nation. So in my case, it would be like if we moved from Ohio to Florida because a governor of Ohio was causing problems or seeking our death. So we would leave, but we're not leaving the United States. We're not fleeing in the sense of leaving to go to another nation because everywhere in that nation is unsafe. In fact, in Egypt, the power of King Herod held none, really, at all. He could make petition, but the reality is he had no power to actually bring them back because he was very specifically located in those areas. It's just different, and these differences matter. To claim refugee status the way we see it today, in fact, and to kind of malign or alter the word to become all-inclusive to any person who they don't even have to cross a border. They just feel unsafe in one area, so they go somewhere else as a refugee, is a disservice to what I would call true refugees, individuals who are having to flee war-torn areas and the rest. We do great disservice when we water down these words to mean whatever we want, especially for political opinions that we like to associate or attach to them. A refugee in modern terms is someone forced to flee their country due to persecution, war, or violence. Jesus' family did move from Bethlehem to Egypt to escape Herod's decree, which could be interpreted as fleeing persecution. But then again, this was within the Roman Empire, not crossing international borders as we understand it today. And I do believe these terms matter. Now, you might argue I'm being very pedantic about this. I'm being very particular about this terminology. But as I noted, I think the words matter. I think how we utilize these words matter in this premise. He was not fleeing to a different country. Egypt was still under Roman occupied territory. He went to another area where they could live in peace for a time, and that's what they did. Now, we see this because after Herod's death, Jesus' family returned to Nazareth, indicating that a temporary displacement and not a modern refugee status as we utilize the terminology. There's a difference between these two. The identity of Palestinians, and this is kind of a separate point, as a distinct national group, largely developed in the 20th century, particularly in response to Zionist immigration and the establishment of Israel in 1948. Prior to that, most of them were not known as Palestinians. There would have been historical Arabs, historical Muslims. They would have been from different groups, tribes, and the rest. But it wasn't really until the establishment of Israel and the Zionist movement of the late 1800s that we start seeing or hearing the terminology Palestinians as a national group. In fact, we rarely hear it as a national group even today. But even adopting a flag was in the 1970s and 80s and the rest. Even that, there's no national identity. It's just a terminology that started to being used in the 20th century predominantly. So applying the term refugee to Jesus can be seen as more symbolic or political statement rather than a historical fact, often used in contemporary discussions to draw modern-day parallels, which is what I believe that sign was trying to do, but it's just not historically accurate. The gospel narratives describe Jesus' birth, early life, and movements, but do not use the term Palestinian or refugee in their original context. It's just not there. And so to add to that, that's where it becomes problematic. Because I can note this, when we misuse words, we end up creating problems that I don't think we intended to create, but it makes people less likely to believe us when we misuse terminologies to try to make a point because we think it's cute or we think it's connective in some way, but in reality it actually devalues our ultimate point. Roman documents, Jewish writings from the period, including Josephus, and other early Christian texts focus on the region's Jewish character and Roman governments, not a Palestinian identity. Historians and biblical scholars agree that Jesus was Jewish, lived in Roman-occupied Judea, and the modern concept of Palestinian nationality did not exist during his life. Thus, Jesus was not a Palestinian refugee. Now, this is not a comment on the Palestinian war, on conflicts in Gaza and Israel and the rest, or modern-day constructs. This is merely a comment on who Jesus was. Jesus was not a Palestinian refugee.